Price wars. The world used to be one way, then it became another. Now parts of it want to go back to being like it was before. One man would hang his wet clothes on bushes and trees in his backyard to dry so that he could take quick glances out there and momentarily pretend there was someone out there besides just him. On one world, after all the normal creatures had been made, a final batch was created who were split in two. And soon they began to concoct myths of how they were originally a single whole being who had been divided into two parts as some punishment, and whose challenge it was now to find and merge with their other half. What a great story. What a load of crap. Were it not for the limitations of dichotomies, men could not think nor speak as they do. One astronaut's conclusion: space travel don't mean shit to a dot over an I. One man explained his periodic use of drugs and alcohol by saying that it was just to prove to himself that it was possible to be even less conscious and perceptive than he normally is. And by God, you got to admit, explanations don't get much better than that. An attorney for Anchor Hocking Glass is seeking injunctive relief, claiming that explanations such as the one above unfairly infringe on their wraparound windshield design. Only the dumb get dumber, and even they wouldn't do so had they not been born stupid. At the conference, one man stood and offered the suggestion that thinking might just be a virus that man somehow had picked up. But the conferees, being all ordinary and decent men, booed down the idea. There was once a certain activity going on, but with no one to witness it. Well, that's not exactly true. There were people there, constantly in sight of it, but hardly anyone ever seemed to be paying any attention to it. But here's what's really weird and strange. The activity itself, in part, was based on the potential viewer's ability to witness it. At the conference, a man stood and said, "As representative of my constituency, I'd like to say that we find nothing taking place here to be of any real value." And someone on the other side of the room stood and said, "But you have no constituency. You represent no one but yourself." And the first man answered, "Ah, yes, same as us all." Then, sensing the severe lack of positive audience response to his comment, the first man offered, "Okay, I make a motion that we all take a nap." One day a certain man suddenly realized, if it weren't for the past, we'd be exactly like we are now. According to a legend, a creature from another reality once visited Earth and was primarily struck by one feature: that men paid money to see other men push, kick, beat, and kill one another, but did not to hear someone explain what life was about. Jeez, what a crummy legend, and so self-serving. Okay, how's about a really good legend? Man was born originally in the high mountains of ancient China. Then as he developed, he moved to the foothills of India. Then later on to the plains of Hungary. Then to the seashores of France. And then, while no one was looking, some of them started sneaking back toward China. We confidently await medical science's discovery that the human nervous system is a legend. At least a similar legend. In serve yourself restaurants, the knowledgeable don't have to take a number and wait in line. A viewer writes, "Is there a real difference between those who know what's going on and those who talk about it? If so, how could this ever be adequately described in words? That which is self-serving is of no offense to those who have ceased to dine solely on their own feet and hands. The circular nature of cannibalism is the circular nature of knowledge everywhere outside of China. One man had a philosophy of life that wasn't fit to print, which was matched by his brother's publishing company, which lacked a philosophy. And a viewer writes, "Why do you so seldom use the word discernible? On some worlds, men believe that it is the ducks in a row that create the row, while in areas of greater dimensions, they laugh at such foolishness." And a viewer writes, "I'm getting a terrible headache. Can you get me any remedies from China?" At the Mystics Conference, someone suddenly leaped up on the head table and began to sing, "Oh, you can talk about Paris or Istanbul. Talk like you're smart or like you're a fool. Oh, you can talk about anything you want to do, but honey, don't talk about things you can't talk about." For his part in the show, he was later awarded the Golden Nerf Tap Shoes Trophy. One man's favorite question was, "Does the sun arise each day just to be seen by me?" We have no record of what might be the sun's pet query. There's a pretty simple way to tell if what you're hearing or reading has any real mystical content or is simply bullshit. If it's serious, it's bullshit. At the conference, a man stood and said, "Man is the only species which gives birth to twins." And someone near him responded, "That is certainly not so. Many other animals experience multiple births." And the man replied, "You just don't get it, do you?" And they voted and agreed that no, they didn't. Another way in which life protects itself and its private operations is when someone does happen to get a glimpse of what's really going on, it'll immediately follow up with a comment, "Now don't quote me on that." A viewer writes, "After listening for some time to you talking about life as though it is an actual living thing interacting with man, even at a verbal level, it makes me ask this question. How would life speak to man other than through the thoughts that go through his mind?" The simple sometimes claim that gods and other external supernatural forces speak to them personally. Such claims make the reality of what mystics actually experience sound rather unimpressive. One man's ponderings came to this: is the potential value of living as a recluse in that you're ultimately faced with the fact that no one's talking to you but you. Another chap's musing arrived at this juncture. Is the reason mystics have so consistently had bad things to say about sleep because it gives the internal voices even greater leeway? And when one man first heard of a song with the title, "It Had to Be You," he was amazed that he was able to wonder, who? On this one planet, the creatures at the top of the evolutionary ladder were robots, atop which were perched parrots. At the conference, a man stood and said, "It is now my conclusion that all ills this side of death can be successfully treated by a mere increase in water consumption." And someone at the head table replied, "But why exclude death from your crackpot idea?" And the man pondered this for a moment, then added, "All right, then I propose that we include death." And it was unanimously approved. Just as not all blues songs are negative and depressing, so too are not all facts true and informative. A viewer who wrote to us on our last show asking if I didn't write all the letters from viewers but his, has written again, noting that I never did answer him. As attorney for the Green Brothers International Midway Shows and Attractions, is seeking injunctive relief to prohibit the further use of human language as being an illegal use of their copyrighted Trick House of Mirrors. Another provocative feature of activities such as this is that it can be made to sound like an unnecessary burden and complication to man's already stressful and frustrating life. While to the few inherently primed for it, it's actually the only aspect of life that is nourishing and satisfying. The final word regarding the reliability of mental knowledge. 100% of an error is still an error. Thank you, and be sure and write if you find another word. At the Let's Talk About Things Mystical Conference, a man stood and said, "The purpose in the publications of these purported train schedules to Istanbul is simply to keep people so involved in studying them that they don't get around to being upset about never going there." And someone in the audience suggested that, by Jove, that seemed to be a darn good purpose, and one that we should all be in favor of, which it seemed most of them were. A man who had spent a lifetime studying such matters finally came to this conclusion. All the many symbols depicted in all man's many religions and cultures all symbolize the same exact thing. God, I wish I knew what it was. End of quote. One day a man put his arms around one of the trees in his yard and said, "You've always been one of my favorites." And the tree asked, "Why?" And the man replied, "There's no particular reason, for if there was, you wouldn't be one of my favorites." Legend has it that this story originally concerned two humans, two extraordinary humans. For you students of transcendental history, there has only been one serious mystic, and he's dead. His latest book was entitled, "A World of Talk is a World of Sorrow," and he would autograph copies with the name Dr. Boo-Hoo. Or, as Mr. Holland sought confirmation from Professor Tunnell by asking, "Still no way out, right?" The only way the mystical makes any sense to the ordinary is by them taking it literally, which of course ruins it. The only way the mystical makes any sense to the ordinary is by them taking it literally, which of course ruins it. Look at religion, philosophy, and every other thing that men believe they take seriously. In the middle of the conference, a man unexpectedly stood and exclaimed, "Stop! Forget all your theories and speculations. I suddenly realize what's really going on in this matter." And the chairman banged hard his gavel and quickly silenced the chap by declaring, "Sir, we are professionals here, trained experts in our field. We do not suddenly realize things." One man so said to his son, "If you still think that ordinary talk has any significance, just listen to news reports." When the producers decided to do a feature on a well-known mystic, they intended to call it "The Man Behind the Persona We See." But it fell through once they discovered that there was nothing else behind it. In a sense, all humans are wannabe immigrants, hungry for a new state. In case anyone is still unclear, here's tonight's final hint. The tracks between Paris and Istanbul are laid out in your own nervous system. And all remain hungry for a new state and destination. I can say in line with several things we've been talking about, but who cares? What does it matter? I could be fooling. Who's going to remember? What was I saying? Well, it concerns, or I'll make it touch on at least two items that I read little stories about tonight. One having to do with the fact that for the mystical to make any sense, the metaphorical to make any sense, which I meant mystical at the time, the ordinary have to take it literally, which of course ruins it. That in conjunction with something that we had been talking about, of whether certain aspects of known history, supposedly known history, and some of the figures, did they actually exist? Does it matter? Were they metaphorical? And I might also drag in tonight, I recommend to everyone's consideration one more time, if I never get around to it, to just privately with yourself, in the midst of all of this and anything you're doing on your own, to consider the specific difference, what should be, between metaphor and symbolism. And as you know, I'm no wise attempting to give a lesson in literature, linguistics, or in fact anything. But consider that metaphor in the real technical sense, or at least the way I'm going to tell you. A metaphor is something that means, that says one thing and means something else. Whereas a symbolism can say something and mean that and something else. I don't guess I'll get into it tonight, but consider, I was about to drag out another example having to do with metaphor and etc., and how men have to take it literally, and what does it matter? Or perhaps it does matter. Just because I keep saying what does it matter and make it sound like a rhetorical fait accompli, that doesn't mean it's a rhetorical fait accompli. It could be maybe a green or even a pinstripe metaphorical fait accompli. The one I had in mind, again, of something that sounds so strange, I was going to return to that very popular era of 600 or 700 years before A.D., back to China and the idea of Confucius and he and some of his followers. And to point out again, it doesn't matter, I'm just using the name, the same way I oftentimes do Buddha or Christianity. It doesn't matter whether there was such a person, but I'm going ahead and make it easy, because the writings are scattered everywhere, and historically I don't think anyone even attempts to pinpoint it. But still they refer to a Confucian era, some of the earliest records of an attempted philosophy. So when I say Confucius, I'm really now referring to a certain, to a particular era and a particular area, and some particular ideas. But here we go. If you recall, several shows ago, I made up a little story and then pointed out that there were even things along a similar vein that it's attributed to Confucius, that he told his followers that they should abandon any state that is too orderly run and seek out one where disorder, chaos prevails. The whole idea of the Confucian era, or Confucius, he is looked at by many people now historically. I'm just using ordinary views without any of my comments about the ordinary history of things. But is looked at as being not only one of the first recorded philosophers, anyone who seemed to have had enough of his ideas written down, but he is also just considered to be a civil philosopher, that I have never heard him referred to as a mystic. He is referred to and taken to be a philosophy when I say a civil philosopher, all his writings are all about a good citizen, a good king, a good ruler, what would constitute a good kingdom. And it all fits, because according to history, that was a very tumultuous time in Chinese history. The whole string, a whole dynasty, several supposed bloodthirsty cutthroats that oppressed the people, and etc. And Confucius's writings, all those attributed to him and his immediate school, are all just very specific, having to do with what a good king would do. And I guess even sometimes a little more subtle or a little more specific, into what would constitute a good bureaucracy under a king, what a good ruler would set up to be a government, what would be fair to the people. And there seems to be nothing in the writing, if you read it literally, there seems to be nothing that would begin to approach mysticism. It seems to be a philosophical, a whole string, a life spent on philosophical reflections on the nature of the state, of politics, of things about as far removed as from the mystical as you can get. And yet attributed to him, I was going to try and get a new one, or some writings of he and his, again, doesn't matter whether it was actually him, but it's attributed to that whole era, he and his school and his followers, that he gave a warning that a wise man, a philosopher, should abandon close connection, personal contact with a king. And this is after all these books and books, or supposed records of him speaking about all the ways in which a more insightful man, a good man, should try and have some effect on these unruly tyrants. That if there are philosophers, if there are wise men amongst us, they should try and have some effect on the state. They should try and be beacons of charity and compassion for the downtrodden, for the common people, for the ordinary helpless, hapless, weak, impotent man and woman in the village. Now, after all of that, he's also attributed to having someone either ask, or he gave a warning that a wise man should actually stay away from personal intercourse, socializing with a king of any kind. And he goes into some detail to describe what it will do, the position you'll be in, that no matter that the king may welcome the philosopher to enter court and solicit his views and his wisdom, that anyone in the position to be a king, no matter how apparently chivalrous he may be, of how much goodwill he may oosh, or is that gush, that simply by the fact of him being a ruler, no matter how enlightened he may aspire to be, that simply by being a ruler, he is going to feel the hot breath of competition even from someone like a thinker. That is, even if the kingdom's not at war, and he invites the philosopher, someone who has a reputation for being wise, he invites him, come to court, sit with me, honor me with your views, let's have a verbal intercourse, let's have an exchange of ideas, that the king does not want an exchange of ideas. He wants a yes man, and the only reason he's going to invite a renowned thinker is to have a better class of yes man. That rather than having the regular sycophants and the flunkies, the ass-kissers around court, his in-laws, and just the common somebody he promoted from nothing out of the village, to bring in someone who has an outside reputation, and to bring them in, and to say, I'm bringing in this great wise man, he's going to sit here, well, not too high, but I'm going to give him a seat here close to the throne, and I'm going to discourse with him. We're going to swap ideas. That the wise man will immediately, see, Confucius was saying, I'm going to save you some time, because as soon as you get there, assuming you do not lose all your wisdom by being carried away by all the glimmer, the glitz and glitter of the court, you will very shortly realize, if you're a wise man, as soon as you begin to discourse with the king and he starts, oh, I'm so glad to have you here, blah, blah, blah. I've always thought that perhaps a good government would be run by such and such means, or a good king would be a man who would blah, blah, blah. What do you think? And by then, the wise man, says Confucius, has already realized I have put my foot in it. The man did not invite me here to benefit from my wisdom, because a king feels always in competition. Of course, since then it's been written about in all sorts of ways, from Shakespeare on down to metaphorically or symbolically to Tennessee Williams. But that a king will kill his own family. The Greeks wrote about it. A man will kill his son, a father will kill his own son. simply because he sees him as a potential competitor for the throne. And so he is certainly not going to be that impressed, or he's certainly not going to find any exception just because the man's a thinker, just because he invites you into court and you're unarmed, that you've never shown any signs of physical aggression. He does not see you as being a material threat, or a physical, or a martial threat to the throne. But as soon as he begins to discuss with you, the king is going to keep the upper hand. He is not going to say, well, what do you think of my idea about, I say that a good kingdom would be based upon blah, 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 blah. And the philosopher goes, well, that's sort of interesting, but I'm going to tell you the truth. My idea is just about the opposite. Confucius pointed out, to try and save you some time, that no matter what king it is, he is not going to hear that and go, well, my, I never thought about that. You're going to be extremely sorry that you were there, because as soon as you realize that, there you sit, you cannot easily get away. And moreover than that, as soon as you realize it, you're going to be struck for the first time of the extreme danger in which you have placed yourself, and you will then begin not to just lie when you realize I have got to refrain from telling the man actually anything I may think that would conflict with the ideas he expressed. You will not only immediately realize that, you will immediately begin to even bend over backwards and insist. You will begin to place emphasis in what you say. You'll begin to do gestures. You'll begin to go through all kinds of dramatics to reinforce the lies you're trying to tell the king, so as you can get your sweet ass out of there alive. I say I was going to bring up again the Confucian era. For one reason, it seems so far removed, assuming I'm going to pull something else out of this. But the whole thing, well, I'll go ahead and say, I'm going to tell you that there is actually symbolic, or you deal with it, metaphorical or symbolic. You understand one of them eats up the other one, so it can be either. But again, before I get to it, we'll go ahead and assume. I'll go ahead and tell you I'm going to use it. I'm going to give you a metaphorical explanation of it. But look how far removed it is on the surface. One reason I was pulling it out, it could hardly be more far removed from Western ideas of anything mystical. That even when you have the blatant or the assumed metaphorical stories of like Pilgrim's Progress, there seems to be a man going on this long journey and that he's traveling, or the Inferno, but Pilgrim's Progress, a Christian version of a story of a journey, that they read it and it's very easily interpreted because it was a religious man who wrote it. But it's easily interpreted because of the names. He was pretty crude with using the names of the little villages. You know, the poor old pilgrim would suddenly stop in the village of Greed. You know, it doesn't take, no offense, but it doesn't take an extremely high IQ to think, well, maybe not the first one, but after you read, and then he stops along a little hamlet called, Fornication. After two or three, if you got any, just until you may go, this sure is coincidental that he keeps stopping the names of places that are sins according to the church. So at any rate, it becomes fairly obvious, I think, that it's a metaphor. But it's still on the basis that it has a spiritual, or it's still presented on a spiritual basis or in a spiritual context. And the kinds of things, the city of God sort of thing, of St. Augustine, of describing locales or a place where a man lives, a good Christian man. And he's not actually talking about a city. He's describing some kind of, you've taken it to be the attempted kind of spiritual world in which a person would live. At any rate, compared to that, these things from the Confucian era seem about as far removed as you can get. But they're not. Why? Again tonight, if I can try and tell you, don't look for just an absolute punchline to this. It's not for me to say that it is absolute metaphor, it's not, because I've already tried to point out the main basis of me doing this is not only does it not matter, I suggested, but tonight I gave you a news item that I was hoping would make it a little more specific. That whether it was intended to be or not, I'm fixing to take this very thing of Confucius talking about a wise man with a king, which seems about as, I would suggest to most ears, about as unopen to metaphysical mystical interpretation as possible, unless you want to get into professional football and hockey. But other than that, government is about as far removed as you can get on the surface. But remember, whatever it is that life is talking about, the ordinary have to hear it literally to make any sense out of it. So if a Confucius, if somebody like that lived, if a Buddha lived, a Moses lived, it doesn't matter whether he attempted at the time in the language and other circumstances to talk literally or metaphorically. Even if he attempted to talk literally, it is not going to make any sense to anybody, if I may quote myself tonight. Give it to you again. And I gave it to you about as, well, for the mystical to make any sense to the ordinary, they must hear it literally. Now that is the basis of all religion. That is the basis of taking what may or may not have been, which again I point out is not even important, but what could have been someone's original attempt to speak just quite directly. But it was about things mystical, and for the ordinary to make any sense out of it, there is a very easy way historically to tell, and that is, does anybody still remember it? Is it still talked about? They still write about it? If they do, then it made some sense to the ordinary. But for them to make sense of it, and I'm just talking about any sense. Now, I don't mean that they understood anything. All I mean is that they got enough out of it that they remembered it. That somebody goes, I like that. And they turn around and told somebody else. And they told 2 or 3 other people, and somebody wrote it down, and it keeps getting reprinted for other reasons than just as the copyrights run out and it's free. People continue to talk about it. But for it to reach that level, for it to start out and have a life, for it to sustain a life, that is what I mean by the ordinary, to make any sense out of it, they must hear it literally. Once you begin to see that, it diffuses, it just disintegrates all the questions about, is such and such a metaphorical story? Did such and such actually happen? Is that a literal historical event? Or sometimes I read about that same thing about the Trojan horse, or just whatever the hell it was. Hannibal and the elephants. Who knows what? Moses and the bulrushes. Watch out for them bulls. Somebody can read that and think, well, people believe that is history. But even if it was history, why the hell do people keep remembering the Trojan War? And why does everybody, when they think about it, the story, there are 2 or 3 little things you could throw in, but the Trojan horse, that's what pops to people's, what the hell, who cares? What kind of big deal is that? And the person doing what I just did, going through that, they can begin to suspect, what if that was a metaphor for something? All these people hiding inside of this hollow wooden horse and getting this other group of people to open up the gates and go, oh, a present. And then out of the present, out of what appeared to be one thing, leaps something entirely unexpected. And so a person could read that here and there. There are people on the planet, they'll read and go, I wish that's a metaphor for something else. Hey, is dinner ready yet? No, that's about all it amounts to. Unless they can write a book on it or a paper and get a degree, and then they forget about it again. But in the midst of all this, or is everybody following this, that it doesn't matter whether that happened, it doesn't matter whether it didn't happen, it doesn't matter whether it happened exactly like that, and a Homer was standing around and wrote down exactly what happened, and had not a mystical cell in his body, he just wrote a piece of history. Or it could have been that a Homer was standing around, and this didn't happen, and he thought, what if they had brought a wooden horse here, and it was hollow, and they got in, God, that's weird, and he wrote it down as it happened. Or a Homer could have been standing around, and he saw the wooden horse and all that happen, and he thought, wait a minute, this is actually happening, and I see it, I'm going to write it down, because that's my gig as a historian, I got to make a living, so he writes it down. And while he's writing it down, he thinks, I don't guess anybody realizes this, but this is an actual metaphor for a man trying to think some sort of exotic thoughts or something outside his normal pattern. I just covered there about 5 possibilities. There are even more. But in the midst of those 5, whether it did happen literally, whether it didn't happen, whether it did happen literally and somebody just wrote it down and now other people hear that it could have a metaphorical interpretation, or whether it didn't happen and somebody made it up and wrote it down, and then people take it as literal history, or it didn't happen and somebody wrote it down as history, and there are a few people read it as history and wonder, could it have a metaphor? Out of all of that, remember this, from my Adam tonight, out of all of that, the only way that ordinary people make any sense of it, that is, the only reason the story survived, is they do take it literally. So it doesn't matter whether it happened to start with, is the point. But I'm going to get to another point. It makes no difference. It does not come in, it has no bearing whatsoever, except the ordinary minds, which are just cannibals eating on each other's feet, remember, and your own. When nobody else is available, you eat on somebody else's. It is going nowhere. But it just makes you understand, it helps the cannibalistic feast continue, even though the story of the debate, or the story of the Trojan horse, whether it was true history or not, it doesn't matter, but to help the not matter survive, now people discuss whether it actually happened or not. There is no end to cannibalism, by the way. Or if you like it another way, there is no end to a carousel. You can stand there forever. I hate to tell you. You can stand right there, you can decide, well, all right, I'm going to mark out the green horse, all right? Start it, and I'm going to watch. And they started. I don't know how many lives you expect to lead, how much you're trying to avoid unsavory karma. But you can stand there looking for the last horse to the end of the merry-go-round, and you have I think it's known as a sizable wait. Back to Confucius and talking to fellowshipping with a king, no matter how well-mannered, no matter that he invites you there. Forget the king. Forget it being a person. It is your mind. It is your mind as you find yourself. If your name is John Greenberg, then the king is John Greenberg. And I'm not going to stand here and waste our time trying to give some deep philosophical or psychological description of what would constitute a John Greenberg. Whatever John Greenberg feels as a John Greenberg, that's it. Anything else is somebody making a living off of it. Anything else is somebody counseling him. A psychologist saying, well, if you got the money and the time, by God, you come see me twice a week, and we'll get into this, and by God, we'll do our darndest to figure out what is a John Greenberg. But assuming that you don't get into such hobbies as that, additional outside cannibalism, then whatever a John Greenberg, when he hears his name, if you holler, John, is that you? And he goes, yes, that's me. That's him. Whatever he goes, yes, that's me. That's John. The king is John Greenberg. The wise man would be if our John Greenberg had any indigenous mystical wiring potential. If he was born primed for this, which is the only way, that he fooled around with us. And in fact, to get to the level that the Confucian warning has any usable validity, it would have to be someone who had been struggling along with this, pursuing this course for a considerable part of their life. They would have to have been some years involved with this and be to the point that there seems to be, oftentimes in their mind, close to a merging that a man begins to feel. Now I'll just put general made-up sentences in my generally made-up figure's mind. That he is no longer sure that there is such a thing perhaps as an absolute awakening, a real period of enlightenment, but that he just begins to understand more and more, that he has a greater depth vision of what life is about, that he has less complaints with other humans, all those sorts of things that would sound as though they were tree ornaments, Christmas ornaments on the tree of enlightenment. Whether he has the actual tree in his possession yet, and I'm not making fun of it, but he feels as though if I am not of Buddhahood, if I am not of Buddha mind now, if I am not Confucius's wise citizen or wise king, if I am not on Lao's correct path, if I'm not on the Tao itself, if my mind, as with the Tibetan lamas, has not been liberated, I am at least no longer what I was, and that I can more and more sort of figure out what's going on in life. I can see the error of other people's thinking and some of my own thinking. Confucius was saying, do not sit the wise part of your mind down with the king, no matter how tolerant, no matter how enlightened this new John Greenberg, king, seems to be. Because it is the nature of those in power. They cannot help it any more than a wise man can help wanting to be wiser, any more than a man somewhat awakened only has one desire. I want to be more awakened. The man enlightened, I want more enlightenment. That's all. It's quite simple. A ruler, whoever is in control, this is in control of a man. That's not the truth. But by ordinary, civilized, sophisticated views, men think that this is what is the controlling factor, regardless of any individual complaints they may have against their own degree of education or ability to think logically. It's not that. It's when John Greenberg hears somebody hollers, "John, is that you?" And he goes, "Yes, it's me." He's speaking from here. Because he knows it's from here. Confucius. You can take this story that apparently had no possible connotations to anything mystical or transcendental and see that it quite easily does. That it's not, although it could have been. Because everything he described between a wise man and a king, I assume that all of you got it. That's why I went through it. It is absolutely true. And that he is not the last, not the only person who's ever made such comments as that. Buddhist literature, Sufi literature, Christianity has got stories. The Old Testament's full of them. All you got to know is how to read them correctly. Of a king, hearing of some prophet, some wise man, and the king seems to be in such power that he's trying to become a Nebuchadnezzar or trying to become a Constantine, trying to become an enlightened ruler. And he solicits outside opinions. He beckons those with conflicting, alternate views to come forth. I'm a man of goodwill. I'm an open-minded man. I am here to learn. That, in regal circles, is not normally, they don't like the communists know it. That is known as royal horseshit. No one in power. That's one of the secrets of life, again, that life wanted me to quit while I was ahead, or you were ahead, to quit giving you all these secrets. But everything you ever hear throughout history, and it's going on right today, you can turn on the news tonight, I guarantee you, and there'll be some right here, and it doesn't get much more enlightened than Paris, and you'll hear people right here in our own parliament, the upper and lower chambers. You'll hear our own prime minister. You'll hear our own president, if you had anything to say. You will hear tonight on the news, anytime turn it on, and somebody in Parliament, some of our elected officials, will be saying something of the nature of about what he gave up for public service, why he may get out of public service, why he's opposing some plan from an opposition party solely because it is taking away some of the privileges, is going to hurt the common people. All of that is absolute bullshit. And at one level, at the hormonal level, any sane wolf, that is, any sane Frenchman, or German, or American, if the body could listen and had any comment, it would go, "Oh, bullshit." It is like any wolf, this down the pecking order, any chimp, this below leadership of the pack, hearing, if they engage in talk, of hearing the head chimp, the head wolf, one day sit around and apparently get reflective and go, sometimes I think, the job's not worth it. All the responsibility of having to look after all you young wimps, having to service all the women, having to always fight off. You don't know what I gave up. Some people said I used to have a pretty good voice, but I ended up, I don't know, sometimes I think I should just give it all up. Yeah. But I have the responsibility. I feel you people elected me to this office, you chose me, and I feel a certain responsibility. Right. At any rate, I was going to say that if you want to go back, those of you that are going to deal with whether it's symbolic or metaphorical, Confucius's caveat is true, because no enlightened ruler, no one in power, and it doesn't have to be that extreme, and in times and places like most of the people hearing this, that is the Western world, republics and democracies, it seems to be less specific, and it seems that examples would be harder to find, and they're not. They're just more subtle. But if you were a philosopher, if you're a Nobel Prize winner in religion or philosophy, and the president, an elected official, you couldn't call him a tyrant, an elected official, the elected president of Norway, calls you in and says he'd like to confer with you. He doesn't want to confer with you. He may want a photo op, maybe an election coming, he wants to be photographed here with a philosopher or with a theologian, or he may even want some kind of conversation, but not the conversation you think. He did not seek out power. He was not his hormones. He is not wired up. Neither him nor the head wolf of any local pack out in the woods. They were not wired up to be humanitarians. And as I pointed out, at the hormonal level, the animal level, you sure as hell don't want them. And if you have any sense, even though times are getting apparently a bit more civilized, you still do not want a philosopher running governments. You want a wolf, you want a president that is down there, you want a president, a leader, that's this close to being a madman, but can dress up, knows which fork to use at state dinners, and can refrain by and large from trying to stage coups continually to stay in power. But other than that, you want more or less a mad dog killer. That's who you want. But the mind says otherwise. Back to the Confucian. It is literally true what he said. So the ordinary took that as being literally true. And it is true. Anytime you take that which is a correct statement, literally, and you can find and you can make a deeper, more expansive interpretation of it, it in no wise ever affects the literal validity of it. And so we have now some of the oldest writings. We have writings that have now survived 2,500 years easily, taken as being fact that this man did say such and such, and he pointed out things that a few people, not even everybody in the street, would bother to read if you just hand that paragraph and said, hey, read what this guy said. And it was about a wise man will not go and have social intercourse or discussion with a king, no matter how, and blah, blah, blah. Most people, you understand, if it's just a long paragraph, they'd get bored and wouldn't even finish that. They'd go, what's the point? What is this? What is this? Survey? What is this? Did I get a coupon? What's the prize? What is this? But if they did read it, and you said, do you see anything, does anything sound funny about that? If they read it and could comprehend what was being said, they'd say no. And even if they said, well, now that I think about it, it sounds like it makes sense. And then if you ask them, would you see any possible deeper significance to it? The point is, they just barely see any significance to it literally. That's the only way that it makes any sense whatsoever. That's the only way that you can take an ordinary person. Now let's get off the guy in the street. Take somebody whose field, you'd have to get somebody whose field of expertise, that their academic specialty is not early Chinese philosophy. But anyone else, you could take somebody that was, their expertise could be in medieval British lit or philosophy. And if you showed them that from Confucius about a wise man not going and having intercourse with a king, and the king does not really seek enlightenment, he is not seeking to hear the wise man's opinions. The only way that they, when I say make any sense, that they would actually read it and go, well, I knew the name Confucius, of course, but I never even, that's interesting. For them to say interesting, that means it made some sense, that they got some significance. And if you say, well, what's the significance? And they go, well, didn't you read it? You want to hand it to me? And I go, yeah, but I wondered, what do you think it means? They go, what do you mean, what does it mean? You go, what do you think it really means? They go, well, I don't know what you mean. It means that a wise man, a philosopher, has got no business sitting around trying to discuss things with a king, because anybody in power is not going to, if your philosophy ultimately conflicts with theirs, they don't want to hear it. And you could be running a risk. They're not going to enjoy hearing it. I mean, that's what it means. What do you mean, what does it mean? And you go, well, what does it really mean? I go, that's all it means. But that, by God, that means a lot right there. I'm impressed. I just never knew that Confucius wrote something like that. That's the only way they made any sense out of it. But let me ask you this. Why do people keep repeating it? Why has it lasted 2,500 years or more? What pertinence does that have? Why do they keep repeating that? Why do they keep republishing it other than the copyrights run out? Why do they do it? Why can somebody repeat it now? And you have a room full of educated people go, that is true. That is, by God, true. In fact, you said it was Confucius, and he wrote what was that in? Where could I find that? The only way that makes any sense to them is to take it literally. But then I was asking you, really rhetorically, even taking that literally, why the hell do people remember it? How could they explain it? How about those who continue to read Confucius? How about those who continue to insist on quoting him, let's say? And you say, well, what pertinence does that have to us today? How would they explain it? I'm asking you rhetorically. The point is they would be hard-pressed to explain it, what it means. Then the question is, well, why do they keep repeating it? It's because it was something else, and it doesn't matter whether he meant it or not, or whether any of this happened. Just because that is a fact that a wise man's got no business taking the invitation of a king to come discuss philosophy. Got no business, not unless he's got a death wish. He got no business doing it. It's not going to accomplish anything. He's going to end up doing whatever it takes to get out there alive. Of what significance is that? But that's the only way that this could have come out and made any sense enough to survive and to be repeated for 2,500 years, is that what it was referring to is, if you try and take, once you get some idea, once you've got a piece of a wise man in you, you've got some part of your brain cells, you've got some neural connections now, that you were born in such a way and they got primed and whatever we're not going into, but you ended up having some views, some knowledge of life that transcends the literal, that transcends the interpretations of the obvious. And you begin to see more and more what the obvious is, and it doesn't need interpretations. That is Confucius's wise man. Then what it means is you got no business then trying to compare that to, trying to use as a benchmark or trying to use as a sounding board your regular mind. You got no business. If you become this much of a mystic, you got no business then trying to mix that with anything else. There's nowhere to go with that one piece and think, well, I'll expand it in this way. I'll take the rest of me and I'll enlighten me from that part. You betcha. I will discuss it. I will reflect on it. Now, there's ways to do that, which I keep trying to hint. But insofar as you're going to sit around under any normal conditions using anything resembling your normal mind and think, well, all right, I get glimpses. In fact, I got one glimpse. I heard something that he said the other night, and it struck me, God, that's it. And you know what that reminds me of? That reminds me of something I read by Guru so-and-so or Yogi so, or something that I thought one time that maybe you are in a discussion, you have taken the invitation, you just didn't see it that way, of your own king, of your own ruler. And any ruler is that close to being a mad dog, bloodthirsty tyrant. He's a madman that close. Well, he is certainly he is never going to give up power. That is not how someone got in power. If you are an ordinary, sane, decent person, remember in here, and this one guy at a conference, he stood and said that he had come to the conclusion, or he said, let me offer this idea. What if thinking is simply a virus? Now take thinking as the very thing we're talking about now, the human mind. He says, what if thinking is simply a virus? You know, a disease, but a virus that man has somehow picked up. And all the other conferees being good, sane, decent, educated people, booed down the idea. That would be a wise man trying to talk to a king. Because he is going to say the least, boo down your ideas. And if that don't work, he'll cut your throat. But forget all that, because now we've gone from literal to metaphor to me taking it back now literally, which I just do that for shock effect. Actually, knowing some of the movies and novels you people read, my attempts at shock effect, I know, look like pig dribble, kitty piss. Pale in comparison, if you insist on your damn run-of-the-mill cliches. There is no way, and of course I'll point out one more that's between sort of the literal interpretation or the literal interpretation of the story and the metaphorical. Is like in between is I could also point out that you've got no business, forget a wise man, a king, you've got no business talking to any other person about anything that might qualify as being the reflections of a wise man. Now, I put it to you simply, I keep strongly suggesting on tape, and in private I have more strongly, specifically, anytime you understand anything, you got no business. You should never turn around and discuss it with anybody. Because they may not be a king, but that is somewhere in the middle. You're still doing yourself potential harm. But you're running grave harm and coming up to a usable metaphorical reality behind the literal telling or interpretation of Confucius's warning. You got no business in your own mind. Look at that as a court in your own mind, your own John Greenberg personality. It is in charge. As long as you're alive and out in public and operating in somewhere as a normal human being, we're out of time for me to try to worry about these terms, but in a sense, he is always king. Did you like the one tonight that some producers decided to do a documentary on a well-known mystic, and they were originally going to call it The Man Behind the Public Persona, the persona we see, but they had, the whole thing fell apart when they realized there wasn't one. That's close to what I'm talking about, because this king, the public persona, should always, if you're going to live in the public, if you're going to pass for an ordinary person, that which you were born with, which you many times along the way, and maybe still have, used to believe, numerous complaints. I'm too pushy, I'm too shy, I don't like the way I act, I don't like anything about me. Hey, it got you 20 or 30 years. If you pass for being sane now, when you go out of the house, if the neighborhood children don't all run after you and try to set you on fire, if you can walk in a grocery store or a bank and people don't throw up or try to just leap at strangers and try to kill you, let it go. That's the king. And you're not trying to overthrow him. But do not enter into discussions. Do not let ideas that you know are of a transcendental nature that would make that one part of you, as your wise man, to try and discuss it, to try and reflect upon it, to try and in some way bring this into your own persona. That is, become a publicly recognized wise man, which is another one about me and the philosopher get into about humility. I've been through that before, and about how a man should be humble. It's not the way it's interpreted. It is, if you start letting on, if you start trying to give out hints like, I don't know whether some of you know it, but I could be a mystic, or I might be. Have you ever heard the term awaken or something? Somebody said, "Go enlighten," and you go, do 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 do, and trying to get them to go, wait a minute, are you insinuating that do 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 do? Confucius would roll over if he was dead in his grave about hearing that. Or he'd roll over in his publisher's grave. Did all get on?